It was the kind of winter evening that seemed tailor-made for stories of the strange and the sinister. The air was cold and thick, carrying the unmistakable bite that settled deep into the bones. The last traces of daylight clung desperately to the sky, a hazy red glow stretching across the horizon, casting everything in an unsettling, blood-tinged light. Shadows, long and distorted, crept across the ground as the sun dipped lower, sinking quickly behind the skeletal trees that surrounded the small, isolated park. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would choose to be at dusk. Tucked far from any main road, the park had a lonely, forgotten quality about it, as if it had been left to rot in silence, known only to the occasional passerby or those desperate enough to seek solitude within its eerie, empty bounds. There was an unnatural stillness, a profound silence interrupted only by the faint creak of rusty chains on an abandoned swing set. The swings moved slightly, their movement aimless and soft, but enough to draw attention, as though touched by invisible hands. Jake and his friend, John, had ventured here without much thought, seeking a quiet spot to talk. They hadn't realized how quickly the light would fade, or how strange the park felt as the shadows deepened. They walked through the playground slowly, their voices quiet, almost as if speaking too loudly would disturb something lying dormant, hidden just beneath the surface. To their left was a zip line with a frayed rope dangling, swaying in the cold breeze, its end dark and worn from years of disuse. In front of them loomed the restroom, a small, run-down building that looked more like an abandoned relic than a place meant for use. The once white walls were now a dull gray, covered in graffiti, dirt, and creeping cracks that seemed to widen in the fading light. The single, broken light above the door flickered weakly, casting a faint, sickly yellow glow that barely illuminated the entrance. The deeper they walked into the park, the more Jake felt a sense of unease. The park was deserted, yet the air felt heavy, almost as if something was watching them from just beyond the tree line, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows. As Jake and John wandered further into the park, a quiet unease had settled over them, though neither spoke of it. The silence around them felt almost unnatural, thick and pressing, as if something was absorbing any sound they might make. The broken-down restroom building loomed in the distance, a decaying, foreboding presence that seemed out of place even in the deserted park. Its concrete walls, once painted bright white, were now peeling and cracked, worn down by years of neglect. Dirt and moss crept along the edges, and layers of graffiti stained the walls, chaotic letters and shapes overlapping until they became meaningless scrawls. Without warning, John stopped and turned to Jake, shifting uncomfortably. He mentioned needing to use the restroom, his voice low, as if worried someone, or something, might hear. Jake nodded, glancing around at the barren playground as John made his way towards the restroom. With each step, John seemed to hesitate, casting quick glances at the walls and ground. The closer he got, the worse the building looked, like something abandoned long ago, left to gather dust and darkness. It smelled faintly of mold and dampness, mixed with an unpleasant, sour stench that seemed to seep from the cracked door frame. Jake watched as John finally reached the entrance, which stood slightly ajar. The dim, flickering light above cast an eerie glow on the door, making it seem like a gateway to something dark and unseen. The door creaked as John pushed it open, echoing in the silence, the sound unnaturally loud against the quiet. He disappeared inside, swallowed up by the gloom, and the door swung shut with a low, final groan. Now alone, Jake shifted his weight, feeling the creeping discomfort grow. He scanned the area, half expecting someone else to appear, though there was no one in sight. Shadows lengthened across the empty playground, stretching over the swings and zip line, giving everything an otherworldly look. The silence seemed thicker now, and even the air felt colder. A prickling sensation crawled up Jake's spine as he glanced back at the restroom door, wondering what exactly lurked in the dark, dank corners of the rundown building. Minutes ticked by, and Jake found himself growing more uneasy by the second, his gaze fixed on the restroom door as if waiting for something, or someone, to emerge. Jake waited in uneasy silence, watching the dim outline of the restroom building as shadows pulled around it like something alive. Each second felt stretched, distorted, amplifying the eerie silence that clung to the park. The quiet was all-encompassing, so heavy that even the faintest creak from the swing sounded sharp, cutting through the air like a whispered threat. The darkening sky cast an ominous glow, tinging everything with a somber shade of gray. Suddenly, a movement caught Jake's eye, pulling his attention to a figure emerging from the shadows nearby. He hadn't heard anyone approach, but there, only a few feet away, stood a middle-aged man. The man's face was partially hidden by the brim of a frayed, dirty cap, and he wore an oversized coat that hung loosely, almost swallowing his frame. His posture was slouched, hands shoved deep into his pockets, but his eyes, the only part of him fully visible, shone with an unnatural glint, cold and assessing. Jake felt a shiver crawl up his spine as he realized the man was staring directly at him, his gaze unwavering, unsettling. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, Jake too startled to move or speak. Then, without any change in his expression, the man took a single step closer, just enough for his features to come into clearer view. His face was rough, weathered, with lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes, giving him a tired yet strangely intense look. Finally, in a low voice, almost a growl, he spoke, his words sharp and chilling. "Bad things could happen in a place like this," the man muttered, his tone carrying a strange certainty, as if he was speaking from experience. The words hung in the air, each syllable weighted, pressing down on Jake like a threat left to linger. The man's gaze stayed locked on Jake, his mouth curling ever so slightly into something that might have been a smirk or a warning. Just as quickly as he had appeared, the man took a step back, his form beginning to blur into the surrounding shadows. With a final, unreadable look, he turned and walked away, his footsteps eerily silent on the frozen ground. Jake was left standing there, rooted in place, the stranger's words echoing in his mind, each syllable replaying with an ominous clarity. He glanced toward the restroom, feeling an overwhelming urge to pull John from the darkness and leave this place behind, but the shadows seemed to close in tighter, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he and John weren't alone. Jake stood alone in the growing shadows, the strange man's words looping endlessly in his mind. Bad things could happen in a place like this. The phrase gnawed at him, settling into the pit of his stomach with an icy dread. Every nerve felt tense, stretched thin by the silence that wrapped around the park, muffling even the faintest sound. The swing sat still now, frozen mid-sway, and the zip line hung motionless as if the air itself had gone still, holding its breath in anticipation. Glancing around, Jake noted how isolated he truly was. The empty playground stretched out in eerie quiet, the broken-down structures looking more sinister in the encroaching dark. The sky above had faded into a cold, steel gray, swallowing the last traces of daylight. It seemed like the park was slowly dissolving into shadows, becoming a place trapped between reality and something darker. Jake's gaze shifted back to the restroom building, a small, rundown structure that seemed to grow more foreboding with each passing second. Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door where John had disappeared. He thought about calling out, his voice sounding weak even in his mind. The building loomed, decaying and silent, its cracked walls casting strange shadows that slithered across the ground. He told himself John was fine, that he would come out any moment, but a prickling unease clawed at him. The restroom seemed to emit a quiet threat, as though it was more than just a building, as if it held secrets that would rather stay hidden. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, amplifying the sense of dread that had settled over him. Jake's ears strained to pick up any sound, but there was only the oppressive silence pressing down. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, hidden in the thickening dark. His eyes darted around the shadows, half expecting to catch a glimpse of the strange man again, lurking just out of sight, his unsettling gaze fixed on him. The cold seemed to deepen, creeping into his bones, leaving him feeling exposed, vulnerable. Every instinct told him to leave, to pull John from whatever darkness lurked inside that restroom and get as far away from the park as possible. But he stayed rooted in place, compelled by a mix of concern and an unspoken fear, his gaze locked on the restroom door as if something monstrous could emerge from it at any moment. Jake shifted his weight, gripping his arms as if to steady himself, trying to shake the gnawing dread that had wormed its way into his mind. Then, just as the tension felt like it might crush him, a faint sound from within the restroom finally broke the silence. Jake's breath hitched, his heart pounding as he waited, hoping it was just John, but bracing himself for something far worse lurking in the shadows. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as Jake stood watching the restroom door. The flickering light above the entrance cast a sickly yellow glow that barely illuminated the rundown building, its cracked walls and grimy tiles visible even from where Jake stood. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second amplifying the dark, foreboding atmosphere surrounding the empty playground. The silence had a weight to it, pressing in from all directions, making Jake's heart pound in his chest as he waited for any sign of his friend. Just then, the restroom door swung open with a sudden, jarring creak, breaking the stillness. Jake tensed, his gaze fixed on the shadowy figure emerging from the darkness. John stepped out slowly, his face pale and drawn, looking as though he'd just witnessed something unspeakable. His eyes were wide, darting around with a frantic energy, and his breathing came in quick, shallow gasps, each one visible in the cold evening air. He barely seemed to notice Jake at first, his gaze still fixed on the restroom door behind him, as if afraid that whatever he had encountered inside might follow him out. Jake took a step forward, his voice low and uncertain as he asked, "John, are you okay?" But John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked back at the restroom, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe tightly, knuckles wide against the darkness. There was a tremble in his stance, as though he was fighting the urge to run, but unable to move, paralyzed by whatever horror he'd just experienced. Finally, John turned to Jake, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was someone in there," he stammered, his voice choked with fear. "He tried to break into the stall," he was shouting, "telling me to get out. I thought he was going to break the door down." Each word came out shakily, as if it took everything John had to say them. His eyes held a haunted look, something Jake had never seen before, like he'd brushed up against something dark, something that had left a mark. Jake's heart raced as he tried to make sense of John's words. His own thoughts flashed back to the stranger's ominous warning, bad things could happen in a place like this. The words now felt disturbingly real, taking on a weight that Jake hadn't felt before. He looked at John, at the pallor of his skin, the slight tremor in his hands, and knew that whatever had happened in that restroom was far beyond an ordinary encounter. Without another word, Jake placed a hand on John's shoulder, steering him away from the restroom. They needed to get away from this place, to leave the eerie shadows and the silence behind. As they walked, Jake cast one last look at the restroom door, its dark entrance yawning like a mouth ready to swallow anyone else who dared to step inside. Jake and John moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the unnerving quiet of the empty park. Neither spoke as they hurried past the swings and zip line, leaving behind the playground that now felt like a place out of a nightmare. Jake stole glances at John, who still looked pale, his eyes glazed and unfocused, as if he were replaying the terrifying encounter in his mind over and over. The park seemed to stretch endlessly in the dim light, each tree casting shadows that twisted and stretched like grasping fingers, reaching out to pull them back. The strange man's words still echoed in Jake's mind, bad things could happen in a place like this. It was a warning that felt more chilling now, lingering in the air with a sinister weight. As they reached the edge of the park, Jake felt a rush of relief, but it was tinged with the unsettling realization that they hadn't truly escaped whatever haunted that restroom. The silence between them spoke volumes, a shared, unspoken understanding that something dark lingered there, waiting. They didn't look back, as if afraid that doing so might bring whatever lurked there closer, following them into the night.